my name is Lil Deverell and I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. I've been working in the field for about 30 years and have had a fairly wide range of experience, but I'm currently now working in a research role with a team developing assistive technology. So what I'm going to be talking about during this session, however, is some work that a couple of colleagues and I have been doing in writing curriculum for O&M programs at a university level. And you'll find out a little bit about the breadth of that experience and how crazy the situation is in Australia when it comes to O&M programs. So I'll share my screen. So are you able to see my screen there?
Yes. Yes.
Yep, great. Okay. So I've done this work with Jodie Morris, who is there at the conference actually presenting in another room at the same time, and Bronwyn Scott, who wasn't able to make it to the conference this year, but we developed this paper and presentation together. I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri mob, the first people in Melbourne, where I live. And today I am going to be talking about O&M professional formation and what I call becoming an O&M insider. And this process has resulted in us identifying 15 O&M threshold concepts, and I'll explain what threshold concepts are on the way through, and also our reasoning behind aiming for 80 or more hours in the client role during professional formation. And this will be a contentious thing, I know. So to give you a little bit of history, I've done some work since probably 2013, when our professional body adopted the comms program in the USA as our certification standard, because we have less than 300 O&M specialists in Australia and New Zealand, and about a third of those are guide dog mobility instructors. And when I started looking into the training programs that we've had since the profession started here in 1971 to support people applying for comms, I soon discovered that we have had 22 different O&M training programs since 1971, which is a ridiculous number, but we don't have critical mass to keep each program going. And the result is that a program is sponsored for a few years by an organisation, and then when the organisation withdraws its funding, then the program crashes and we have to start again. So this means that Jodie, Bronwyn and I have had a bit of experience writing O&M curricula for different programs. Griffith University in Queensland, I wasn't part of the original program, but we got partway through redeveloping that one after a break. The University of Newcastle fed into Macquarie University, and that program ran for about 18, 20 years. And now we've got the University of New South Wales, and that's based in Sydney. Vision Australia program was in Sydney for a while and then moved to Melbourne when Bronwyn moved to Melbourne. And I've been part of the La Trobe University program and also teaching through the Blind Low Vision New Zealand organisation, which ran a comms compliant program as well. So orientation and mobility personnel preparations programs in our region are very messy, and although we look for stability and hope for stability, realistically we just make our programs last as long as we can. So O&M professional formation, It occurred to me probably over 20 years ago that when I was teaching clients, I was teaching more out of my experiences under blindfold than my experiences of being an O&M specialist, especially what I learnt during that training year. It's good to have the opportunity to practice teaching other people, but it's actually the experience that I had under blindfold that informed my observation, my perception of what was happening for a client. And I very much value what Errol Ingram was saying in an earlier session in another room, because it got me thinking really about how we can't understand the blind world by looking at it. The blind world is not the sighted world minus vision. So we have a bit of a problem in our profession. When someone asks us what we do for a living, we kind of go, bah, bah, bah. I'm not quite sure how to explain what we do. We usually give a couple of client examples, but really there's no substitute for getting someone to pop a blindfold on, pop a cane in their hand, and get them to have a try. The trouble is that ever since we're little, we close our eyes and imagine what it's like to be blind. We experience that grief of vision loss. We experience incompetence when we try things, and that can lead us to pity people who are blind and assume that they can't do things. What sight dominant people often fail to realise is that competence comes with practice, and so many people who are blind are so much more competent than sighted people give them credit for. So how do people make that transition from being an O&M outsider who assumes that blindness is a pitiable state and assumes that people can't do things when they're blind, to becoming an O&M insider that understands a little bit more what it's like to operate in the blind world? Note that I'm not saying we know what it's like to be blind all day, every day, but we certainly develop a skill set for operating orientation and mobility in the blind world. So we learn this through tacit embodied knowledge by immersing ourselves in it, not by watching other people. The question is, when we went to write curriculum for the latest O&M program that we were part of, we started trying to pin down what this knowledge is that people are learning through this experience under blindfold. So we got together and realised we had 68 years combined experience in the field. Bronwyn and Jodie and I all have teaching qualifications and classroom experience. We work with all ages in terms of caseload. Bronwyn's now specialised in cortical visual impairment. Jodie's moved to Ireland. And I've certainly done lots of work with kids who have multiple disabilities and vision impairment, and adults with brain injury too. And we all three have been part of writing curriculum, but also teaching all those O&M programs. So COVID presented a really interesting challenge for us because we were having to shift our thinking from the things that we would ordinarily teach in person to find out which parts of the curriculum we could entrust to students to learn at home, and then which parts they definitely needed supervision for. And our concern was that in teaching too much online or offline with independent learning, that the students would actually miss some key concepts. So we used hermeneutical phenomenology really to look at these experiences of working with students who are trainee O&M specialists. And whereas hermeneutics is the study of texts, in hermeneutical phenomenology, you're really studying the body as text, people's behaviour, and working out what the antecedents were to this behaviour, what's happening now, and what might it lead on to. By way of comparisons, we were looking at teaching O&M to clients and trainee O&M specialists and our experience in sort of direct service delivery, if you like. We were looking at our experience of working in multidisciplinary teams with people who aren't O&M specialists, who don't necessarily understand the blind world. We were also looking at developing professional standards over a long period of time. We've done a lot of work on that in Australia. And that means having to make some quite defining decisions about what matters and what doesn't matter in terms of professional practice. So we identified 15 threshold concepts, and we did some analysis of our 22 different programs to work out how much time people spent in the client role during that training process, and really how much is enough. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the end. So what are threshold concepts? You'll be familiar with the idea of concepts because they get built into curriculum, but threshold concepts are particularly troublesome knowledge. They're difficult to grasp, they're counterintuitive, they're bounded and integrative, so they bring things together. And until you get these particular concepts, you don't get to cross the portal into a new realm of knowledge. So you might be familiar with the aha moment when you see the light dawn on someone's face, when they understand finally something that's been difficult for them for a long time. And the amazing thing about threshold concepts is that they are transformative. So once we understand them, we can't go back to unknowing. Interestingly, I worked with a student who had struggled with biology at school, and when she came to do orientation and mobility, she just got stuck in the vision science and brain function course, because it took her 3/4 of the way through the semester to realise that she hadn't understood what a cell is. And of course, all our anatomy is based on our understanding of a cell and its, basic structure within bodily anatomy. So for her, understanding the nature of a cell was a threshold concept, whereas everyone else in the class already knew that and understood that. So this means that threshold concepts are not the same for everyone. Particular people will have particular concepts that are more or less difficult for them to grasp. But Meyer and Land identified 6 types. So there's ritual knowledge, that is, I suppose, has a repetition, a rhythm to it. There's inert knowledge that stays dormant for a while. There's conceptually difficult knowledge. There's alien knowledge that feels quite foreign. Tacit knowledge is a big one in our field because the people that we work with know so much more in their bodies than they can explain with words. And troublesome language, and we do find that we trip over language when trying to explain orientation and mobility to other people. Well, at least we do in Australia. Perhaps others are more articulate. So what are these O&M threshold concepts that Jodie and Bronwyn and I realised were tripping hazards really for our students, and that they needed to work quite hard to understand. And the first one is that the blind world is a whole other place. It is not the sighted world minus vision. It's a whole other place, and you can't understand it by looking at it. You can only understand it by not seeing it. It's not actually a void, and it's rich with information and opportunity. And really, we need to occlude vision to pay attention to what non-visual information is available to people. The second one is that people with low vision or blindness are not automatically disabled by their visual diagnosis. I know that in terms of the international classification of functioning disability and health, we've moved from a medical model to a social model of understanding disability, but the focus is still on disability. I don't know whether you've had the experience, but certainly I've had O&M clients say to me, well, I don't think about myself as disabled. I think about myself as Colin. And I go to work and I do the things that I do. And so there's plenty of people that we work with who don't identify as disabled because they have the skills to do what they want to do in life. The point being that social opinion and low expectations can be really crippling. And if we blind people by definition, then we are doing harm, and that's ethically questionable. We need to expect people without vision to be capable and adventurous, and remember that practice leads to competence and maybe even mastery of particular things. Now, the third one is that not everyone with low vision or blindness is vision impaired. The whole notion of something becoming impaired or damaged is that you have to have it in the first place. People who are congenitally blind have never seen, and you have to have vision to lose it or to have it impaired. The point here is that we are so used to thinking about people from a sight-dominant reference point that we see someone with little or no vision as vision impaired, and we fail to respect the wholeness of blindness. And one of the things that we've started doing in our research group is norm reference things against blindness, and to see, and if we can get it right, if we can understand the blind world, then we can see what changes with ultra low vision rather than thinking about full vision or less. So the result of this is that I always talk about people as, low vision or blind rather than vision impaired. As a matter of principle, again, it's that business of not blinding people by definition. Now, number 4, ultra low vision is not blindness. It can be very useful in O&M. So hear my rage with the World Health Organization, which has 3 categories of blindness. And the first is no light perception, and then there's less than 1/60, and then there's less than 3/60. And I find this extraordinary because it's calling someone blind who actually has sufficient vision to walk around without a long cane and to even read, very large print at near. So I would love to see those categories of blindness changed so that only no light perception is called blindness, because I think that experience of the popular imagination is very powerful in people's minds, that blindness is what we understand when we close our eyes. And I certainly have had so many clients who freak out and become so sad and distressed when their eye specialist tells them that they are now blind. Clearly they can see, clearly they can still read. They'll probably never lose all of their vision. So I'm just not quite sure what's helpful about that definition. In O&M, we know that ultra low vision is great for navigation, for object detection, and even recognising the outlines of things. So very helpful with orientation. Number 5, our O&M clients define their own norms. So there's not much point in having 6 acuity if, as the norm reference, if you've never known full vision and never will know full vision. Again, it's that sight-dominant perspective. And I think one of the things, certainly in Australia, we do pretty well is to understand the client's vision on their own terms and find out how it behaves differently in different situations. So I love that focus on functional vision and functional vision manifesting differently in different conditions. Number 6, low vision can also be more trouble than it's worth. And one of the things that I love seeing when we've completed a long cane program is a person rocking along the local footpath with their eyes closed, even though they have useful low vision. It suggests that they've become really confident in their long cane use, and using low vision becomes an optional extra that they can save for the times that they really need it. Because visual interpretation can take a long time, it can be really tiring, and it can actually slow a person down. And this is very counterintuitive to someone who's very sight dominant and dependent on vision. Number 7, just because you can travel independently doesn't mean you should. 30 years ago, when I did my O&M training initially, there was a sense that the goal was to make the O&M specialist redundant because their client was now super capable and able to travel independently. And there was a bit of a tut, 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 you're not using your skills if people chose to not walk or navigate their way to work, taking an hour and a half each way each day. I think gladly we've shifted in our thinking around that, and the value of independent travel skills is that you can choose how you want to travel rather than being dependent on other people always. But frankly, if I'm going to do an 8-hour day at work, I don't want to have to spend an hour and a half each way getting there and home. That just sounds exhausting to me. So being able to do it is different to having to do it. And it's really important there to not just teach the independent travel skills, but teach good decision making so that our clients are able to deploy their energy to meet their best goals. I find it a bit confronting that some people choose not to learn O&M skills because, frankly, the minute I put a blindfold on and had a long cane in my hand, I loved it. But independent O&M can be slow, it can be scary, it can be lonely, and it can be tiring. And some people just decide they would rather go accompanied. Some people also live in a more communal culture where it's easier to do things with other people. Neighbours and friends are a bit spread out in Australia, a bit thin on the ground. You can be walking down the street and not pass another pedestrian, you know, with a half-hour walk, even in the city sometimes, here where I live. So people jump in their cars and drive off, and it can be quite hard to get help in a pedestrian culture in a low-density place like Australia. In O&M, there is a thing in our culture which I call safety neurosis, where we have helicopter parenting, we have people encouraging others to take care all the time. I feel a bit more inclined to encourage people to take risks because I, think you can take calculated risks. But we're certainly, in Australia at least, a bit smothered by this safety neurosis in the broader culture. But safety is a very slippery notion. And when I did some work a few years ago with guide dog mobility clients, I was astonished at the range of things that make people feel unsafe. Some were concerned about their dog and that other dogs be off the leash when they were out and about. Some were validly concerned about road crossings. Some were concerned about getting mugged at the ATM machine when they were getting money out of the bank. Some were concerned about walking down a footpath that had noisy pedestrians ahead because they weren't sure whether people were having a party or a psychotic episode or were drunk or drugged. So I think it's really important to ask the client what constitutes safety for the client and fit our teaching to that client's sense of safety. Without getting drawn into safety neurosis, because there is duty of care as professionals, but also allowing clients dignity of risk. Number 10, we can't be objective about O&M. Human behaviour can be interpreted many ways. There's a lot in the literature that talks about objective measures and as if objectivity is even possible. Personally, I don't think so in relation to human behaviour. Rather, we build knowledge together about what the client can do. It's that kitchen table conversation where we talk with the client and friends and family and other professionals and build knowledge together about the client's capability. The client's opinion matters in all of this, but it's so profoundly unhelpful to try and measure opinions separately when we're social creatures and we make meaning together. So that's a bit of a statement about epistemology, really, how we understand knowledge. Number 11, clinical and functional paradigms are different. So and as a researcher, this becomes important to me. Clinical performance, clinical assessment is more associated with standardised, repeatable conditions directed by a professional, parts to whole, identifying separate variables and measuring them separately, and the quantitative or measurement data are more important than qualitative data. And there's this notion of gold standard measures in the clinical world. Whereas I think we have a fairly deep understanding of functional vision, that it differs to what how vision behaves in clinical standardised conditions, that functional practice is dynamic, it's unpredictable. I always hesitate about this word, but haesty, it means thisness, this time, this place will never be repeated. So you seize the moment and make the most of what's happening now, because next week, tomorrow, will be innately different. Functional performance, we use a holistic approach and we follow the client's lead in the client's own lived environments. And it's the client's experience that's more important than things that we can measure. And the gold standard in functional practice is person-centred practice. So it's anchoring everything on what the client does. Having worked in research contexts that just assume that we should do clinical everything, I've had to have some fairly robust conversations with people about the necessity for both approaches to assessment. Number 12, not everyone can learn orientation skills. It's been my privilege to work with a neuropsychologist on and off for the last 30 years and still doing so. He's created some measures of spatial cognition, which can be used with people who are blind. And that's been enlightening for me, because I'm now able to use the Stewart tactile maps to assess a client's spatial cognition. And really, if a person does poorly on that test, it's an indicator that they're probably not going to learn to do mental mapping. And in fact, we need to teach non-spatial strategies for navigation as O&M specialists. So we shouldn't assume just because we're O&M specialists that every client can learn mental mapping. Number 13, good O&M decisions are not evidence-based. Now, again, this kicks against mainstream thinking in allied health. I read a great paper from 20 years ago written by a social worker who was suggesting that social workers don't do evidence-based practice either. And it got me thinking a lot about what we do. We certainly learn a catalogue of skills that we can offer to clients, but we don't go into clients' situation with a neat formula of what will certainly work for the client. Rather, we do some rapid analysis when we meet the client in their situation and come up with a timely, tailored, creative solution as we design a program for that client. And sometimes we need to go away and think about that a lot, but sometimes we do our best work flying by the seat of our pants, as we say. So this notion of a line of best fit actually comes out of randomised controlled trials with big data plots. But the line of best fit does not necessarily meet the particular needs of our client, and that tailored service delivery is really, really important for individual O&M clients. Verbal description matters. I don't know if we're particularly inarticulate in Australia, but I have found in every class that I've taught in O&M personnel preparation programs that students just struggle to find the words to describe gestures, environment, situations for the person that they're working with as client. And all the hand waving in the world won't explain anything very useful to the client. So our students have to give voice to visual information and to tacit embodied knowledge and work out what's important to describe and what to leave alone. And then the last one, we use the term, I hear the term a blind community, but I wonder if there is such a thing. I think perhaps in some places there is, but we shouldn't assume that just because people share a visual diagnosis that they feel like they belong together. Some people seem to seek that solidarity, but some people want to run away from that and operate very much within the sighted world because they don't want the stigma that's involved in being put together with the blind population. So I'll just finish off with this business of taking 80 hours in the client role, bearing in mind that if our trainee O&M specialists are working in pairs with one in the instructor role, then 80 hours in the client role means 160 hours in total because the students keep swapping roles. We have had, out of our 22 programs, some with as little as 40 hours in the client role. Some have been 120 hours in the client role or more. The telling thing was when we asked O&M graduates whether they felt job ready and really comfortable, very competent with the skills that they needed to teach after they graduated from their program. We also talked with people who were supervising them when they first entered the workforce. And that's how we came to this 80 hours. 40 hours didn't seem to be enough. In the workplace, the supervisors were having to do a lot of remedial work to upskill those graduates. And the program was set up to facilitate that because it was very much sponsored by the agency in question. But if we're looking at O&M programs being separate from the patronage of a particular blindness organisation, it's important that graduates launch into the workforce sufficiently skilled and know in their bodies the skill set that they're going to teach other people. So we know how to do this well, success-based learning from accompanied semi-solo, solo and drop-off, We've got the environmental complexity scale so that we can work through that. We've got functional assessment tools, which are some that I've created.
Lil, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Using the VROOM tool, which means vision-related outcomes in the O&M, and a suggestion that I heard recently from Montreal, actually, was that we could use the VROOM tool to test low vision simulators and score functional vision when in that client role working with low vision sims. We can also use the OMO tool, which is Orientation and Mobility Outcomes tool, to assess O&M trainees' skills in the client role before they begin their O&M blindfold training, and then after. And it does two things. One is it teaches students to use these functional outcome measures and provides professionals with a common language to talk about the development of competence. But there is, we were certainly told when I did my O&M training program that it wasn't our job to become the perfect client, and I agree, that's not our job. However, as graduates, we cannot teach skills that we don't know. So we have to become au fait enough with the blind mobility skill set to be able to teach it. And some references and contact details. So I'm conscious that the PowerPoint presentations have not been made available sort of through the conference network, but do feel free to get in touch if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. And that's it from me.